I think that's.
Well, we could name the numbers.
That's one way out of it.
Right, we wouldn't need the inflator in the system, then they would, them.
Now we're on, we will call you short.
Okay, we're back live. House Ways and Means.
Now, I don't know, just to me, it's a mess.
Ladies,
I agree.
Yeah.
committee, committee, that's all of us. We're gonna hear from JFO now.
Me too.
Yep.
Morning, I'm Julie Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. So I guess one question before, so there are a couple slide decks on under my name on the committee page. There were a few questions that came up during John's last walkthrough that I could comment on, or I could start going through the slides and we could take it from there. What is the chair's preference?
Let's do the slides.
Okay. So, going ahead and sharing my screen. So, this is posted on the committee page under my name. And this is at request to understand what the numbers that you are seeing in the draft correspond with in estimated amounts and a bit of a comparison. So again, I'm nonpartisan, no policy recommendations, unbiased. So what we're talking about is just briefly level setting basis of what we're talking about, and then talking about how the education opportunity payments or the EOPs would be calculated. I know that John just walked through that through the language, but just outlining what it means in terms of the math. Again, also how the calculation of the sparsity grants and the small school grants would be calculated. And then lastly, an analysis of FY25 ed spending and the education opportunity payments plus the grants that are currently outlined in the draft 1.1 of the strike all amendment. So I'm going to fly through these unless I'm asked to slow down. This is all familiar. Talking about education spending in terms of comparisons. This is what we've been doing throughout the session. It's about 1.88 billion in FY25. We're using FY25 just like all of the other analysis we've looked at. Long-term average daily membership. I do think that this was a question that came up while John was walking through the language. So here's the definition. I mean, the technical term is long-term membership, but it's really the average over 2 years of a district's average daily membership, plus the FTE count of state placed students. 83,368 in FY25. We know it's declining over time. And if I am going too fast, let me know. I just know we're all working.
Representative Brannigan.
So my question is regarding small schools and the average daily membership. Is the average daily membership how we determine what a small school is, or are there other factors?
So I'll get into this in more detail in a couple of slides, but the quick answer to your question is no, we do not use average daily membership for determining a small school. That's based off of enrollment. But we'll talk about what that means in a couple of slides, if that's okay.
Yes, sure.
Okay. And the chair asked me to put together the analysis using the same regions that we've been looking at over time in all of the analysis, so the VSBA regions.
This does not reflect any choice of a school district for the future.
Or its founders.
Yes.
Thank you. You stole my next line. I appreciate it. And again, this is a table that I just pulled from an earlier slide deck. I have shown all of you, but just to remind you in terms of how the long-term ADM, the student count varies across these regions. So that was level setting. Now getting into what is in the bill itself. So calculating the EOPs and the grants for both sparsity and small school. So the strike all amendment draft 1.1 uses the cost adjustments and the weights that were outlined in Colby and Baker's memo from yesterday to calculate a district's education opportunity payment. And then if a school district qualifies, and you've had the conversation what that means, I'll touch on it on the next slide, but the next couple slides, but the school district may also be eligible for a sparsity grant. If the district is eligible for a sparsity grant, it also may be eligible for some small school grants depending on the small schools in that district. And those correspond with the cost adjustments in the memo as well. So the table I know is really small. I put it in there in case you or others were referencing the slides. This is the table from the memo. It's Exhibit 2. So it's what you looked at with Dr. Colby yesterday. And what we see here is the way the numbers that would be used for calculating the education opportunity payment, right? The foundation amount. So the EOP would be calculated by multiplying the base amount of $15,033 by the district's long-term ADM. And then there would be weights also applied for the district depending on the circumstances of that district for students experiencing economic disadvantage and English learners. So essentially it's that long-term weighted average daily membership multiplied by the base amount. We are familiar with the term long-term weighted ADM because that's what we use in current law. But of course, these weights are different than the weights that we have in current law because these weights are reflective of a foundation formula rather than taxing capacity.
Representative Maslin has a question.
Thank you. I may be mixing up what you're going through now with what we heard yesterday from Dr. Colby yesterday about the Ohio assessment or calculations of costs versus federal government costs. And I may be mixing up today and yesterday, but I want to make sure I'm not confusing your work with what she presented to us yesterday. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Happy to touch on that. So the work, the bulk of the work that Colby presented yesterday was assuming that federal funding remains the same.
Gotcha.
So this too is reflective of that assumption. So what we're taking
Okay.
here is we're taking the numbers that were presented by Dr. Colby, which assume that federal funds remain the same and reflect the state share, the amount of dollars that the state would need to be providing, right? And the way that those are calculated is essentially this base cost per student, the 15,033, and then adjustments to that base cost or that base amount for certain circumstances. And here, because later on in the draft that you just walked through, there's the sparsity and the small school grants. Here, we're only touching on the economic disadvantage and English learners. I want to flag that this is in a later slide, but I'll speak to it now to help you center what I'm talking about versus what you heard about yesterday. There's also the tiered English learner weights and the special education weights. Because I don't have the data available or the special education student counts and their categorization, nor do I have the data for the tiers of English learners. I'm applying the simple weights that are on the front page of the memo. So no tiers and no special education weights reflected in this analysis.
Is that another question, but maybe we don't know the answer, but Dr. Cooley seemed to indicate that the Ohio weights were better. No, not, I think I heard it say something like that. Well, anyway, we'll let it go. We'll see where we end up. I just want to make sure we're all talking the same. It makes, where you're going makes sense.
Mhm.
I just want to make sure we're.
So
She definitely said they were comparable to Vermont's
Okay.
circumstances,
Okay.
but not necessarily better. They were just comparable.
Same, depending on which words you use. but yes, thank you.
if, I think the other piece of context that, the underlying analysis, that Dr. Colby presented here is using, the 2018, 2019 pupil weighting study, using updated Vermont data and then rerunning the regressions, right? And so that's why we see here, when we are looking at the findings presented by Dr. Colby, that some of the categories that exist in current law and were reflected in the pupil weighting study from however many years ago, 6 years ago, those cost factors have since changed. So under current law, we have weights for grade levels, because the 2019 pupil weighting study found cost adjustments necessary for grade levels. When Dr. Colby and Baker reran their analysis, they found that no longer were those grade level adjustments necessary with the updated data. So we're looking at updated analysis based off Vermont data. And essentially, let's examine how much spending is in the system and the appropriate way to allocate those dollars.
What is that?
Clarifying, are you not using the term long-term weighted average daily membership just to not be confusing with the current system?
Yes.
Just checking.
Also, I made these slides very late at night.
Just want to make sure I wasn't missing something.
So yes, so we're talking about long-term weighted ADM here, but a different long-term weighted ADM than we have under current law, because we're talking about different weights and a different funding scheme.
That's right.
Okay, so you are referring to.
Yes. Okay, moving on. So that's how we're talking about the EOP, calculating the district's sparsity grant and small school grant. So this is the other piece of that funding that John walked through. So if a district has a population of less than 55 people per square mile, then it would be eligible for a sparsity grant. And this would be calculated by multiplying the district's long-term membership by the cost adjustment that Dr. Colby identified of $1,954. The analysis assumes the same way that geographically necessary small schools are identified in current law, because the rules have not been determined that are outlined in the bill. So essentially, at direction of the chair, I assumed that if a district were to be eligible for a sparsity grant, then we could look into if they are eligible for some small school grant as well. So if a district has more than 55 people per square mile, it's not going to be eligible for a small school grant in this analysis. And that's reflective of current law. The small school weight is also an if then. So first we look at, is a district sparse? If so, do they have small schools that are that would qualify for a small school weight? So this is saying, is a district sparse, less than 55 people? If so, do they have small schools within that district that would be eligible for a small school grant? And to Rep. Brannigan's earlier question about the calculation of the small schools, essentially it's looking at, are there schools with fewer than 100 pupils enrolled? If so, the pupils enrolled in that small school then are multiplied by that 3,157. Right, so if you're a sparse district with a small school that has 50 students, and that's the only small school in the district, that district would receive a small school grant of 50 multiplied by your cost adjustment here.
So first, they have to have sparsity.
The way that I have analyzed it, yes. In the language there, it outlines that I think the term, John, I'm quasi phoning a friend, the term is geographically necessary small school.
I think that's right.
Something like, yeah, so, but that is still, I think, some of the decisions regarding the rules of that determination are outstanding.
So that's a new thing for us, right? It's a new factor. A
No,
new factor.
no, under current law, we have tax capacity weights, but the tax capacity weights that we have a sparsity weight. That's actually, there are 3 categories of sparsity in current law, so 3 different buckets. And then if a district is sparse, it could then qualify for a small school weight, also based off of enrollment. And under current law, there's actually two buckets of small school weighting. There's the up to 100 students and then 100 to 250 students. So this is in terms of cost adjustment categories, relatively consistent with current law, with the exception that now the eligibility parameters for both the sparsity as well as the small school have been winnowed.
So before we go any further, John, would you identify yourself?
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel.
Because you commented earlier. What's on track? Representative Holcomb.
But just to be clear, the other difference is in this model that we're approving on the foundation plan, you don't get the small school grant unless you're actually operating a school, whereas currently you get the small grant even if you're not operating a school.
Okay, so moving on to that's how the sparsity grant and the small school grant would be calculated. And so then the modeling itself, so I want to note that this is preliminary analysis based on numbers that were received yesterday morning, right? And what we're doing is we're estimating the education opportunity payment, the sparsity grant, and the small school grant if this funding scheme were to take place in FY25 using our FY25 data. I also mentioned this earlier that because of data constraints, I'm not looking into weights of special education nor the tiered English learner weights. We also spoke about this, but I'm using the small school data that exists under current law in FY25. So of course, depending on the parameters of the districts that are still to be determined, the sparsity is also still to be determined, right? Because we don't know what the districts will be. And then we don't know which small schools will exist within which districts, because that's also still to be determined. So we're looking at the VSBA regions, but those boundaries significantly will impact the funding allocation and the funding amounts, as well as the relative change between current law and the proposed funding formula. So, so here is the preliminary modeling of, I guess I could have had this bigger the whole time. But what we're looking at here is those VSBA regions, their estimated EOP, right? So the EOP is calculated by taking the base amount multiplied by the long-term weighted ADM of the district. Long-term weighted ADM is long-term ADM plus English learner weight plus economically disadvantaged weight. We then have the estimated sparsity grant. So again, this is if a district has fewer than 55 people per square mile, it would be eligible for the sparsity grant, which is taking the district's long-term ADM multiplied by that cost adjustment. I worked with Vermont GIS to get the sparsity of the VSBA regions. So that's how we have the sparsity here. This is looking at the estimated small school grant in FY '25. Again, only district could only receive a small school grant in the assumptions of this modeling if they were sparse. And that is looking at that is calculated by the enrollment within schools of less than 100 multiplied by the cost adjustment. So for instance, some paper somewhere here, but I'm a little more flustered than normal. I think sleep will do that to you. So for instance, for calculating the small school grant, I thought perhaps this might be a helpful metric. You know, looking at Bennington, the long-term ADM is about 5,500. I'm rounding. But the number of students enrolled in a small school is only 113. Right? So the full student count in Bennington is not receiving a small school grant, only those in a small school. And then this is the comparison to education spending under current law. So what we're looking at here in this table is of the VSBA regions, the FY '25 education spending. And then here we have the FY '25 total education opportunity payment plus grants. So this is the sum of those three columns on the prior slide. EOP plus sparsity plus small school, which we see is estimated to be about 1.9 billion. The next column, we see the estimated difference in spending in dollar amounts. So if it's negative, it means that region would experience a decrease in the foundation formula as currently drafted. We see that 8 of these regions would be estimated to see an increase, while 3 would have an estimated decrease. The amount of those estimated increases and decreases, of course, varies. And finally, this column shows the relative difference between the education spending and the total EOP plus grants.
Representative Burkhardt.
Julie, I'm just trying to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. So the FY '25 education spending column, does that include the transportation and CTE and special education block grants?
No.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we were comparing apples. And I'm assuming based on what you've said is in the column for the new EOP, that doesn't include it either. I just want to make sure that we were comparing apples to apples.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, this is as close to an apples to apples comparison that we can get right now. You'll recall that the way that education spending is calculated is by taking a school district's total budget minus its offsetting revenue, so minus those block grants, the special education, the transportation reimbursement. That being said, we know that school districts often spend more, for instance, on special education than they are receiving in the block grant. And so that would fit into the education spending. Professor Colby and Baker, Dr. Colby and Baker in their work used the FY '25 and prior years education spending data and other data to estimate the cost adjustments that we're looking at here.
Just for the committee's sake, 1.8 billion in the education payment 2025. Other spending is about 500 million on top of that. So that is not reflected on there, that 500.
Yeah.
Correct. We're just, if you go back what feels like maybe a lifetime ago when we were working on the yield bill, and looking at the Ed Fund Outlook, there was that line education payment, right? Which is the vast bulk of the education fund appropriations, but of course not all of the education fund appropriations. And it is line 11, looking over Pigley's shoulder. So that's what we're looking at here. And the way that I did this is I essentially looked at all of the current law districts education spending and then aggregated that education spending number up into the regions so that we can have apples to apples.
Representative Feltus.
Perhaps other people are interested, but I'm interested in how you got this FY 25 education spending column. Did you literally go through and say you got 4,000 students that are economically advantaged and therefore they're worth this? I mean, you had a total number of students and each one is 15,000, and then you had a bunch of other students who were 15 plus 15 or
For the, are you referencing the FY 25 ed spending or
Yes.
the education opportunity?
the education opportunity.
Okay, so yeah, what I did is I took for all of our current law districts in FY 25, the pupil counts. And I said, okay. What was the long-term ADM?
Mhm.
Multiply that by the base,
By the 15.
by the 15,033. Within each district, how many students are from an economically disadvantaged background? Multiply that by the
15 and another 15.
the weight and the base. Or really, maybe I'm making this more complicated than it needs to be. I first just calculated what the long-term weighted ADM would be at each of the current law districts. So I said, how many long-term ADM are there in each district? How many students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds? Apply the economically disadvantaged background weight. How many English learners? Apply the English learner weight. Then we add up long-term ADM plus weights for economically disadvantaged plus weights for English learners and multiply that by the base of 1533.
And does that come out the same way if you actually went per student?
Yes.
I tried to do that calculation both ways.
Yes.
And I should know the answer to this, but I don't. So when you're calculating the FY 25 using Colby's weights for English language learners, so adding that, you're not adding the 5 different categories that we're considering for English language learning because we don't have those specified in the data from AOE. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So
Yes.
What are you using for a weight there instead?
The 1.39, which is, you'll recall on the front page of the memo, there's the table that's summarizing. If you were to have a single EL weight, Dr. Colby calculates that would be 1.39. If you were to have multiple EL weights, then we're talking about multiple EL weights. So for this instance, I'm just using the 1.39.
It could be lower in some places and higher in others, depending on the concentration of students with EL needs.
Yes, absolutely.
And their proficiency levels.
Yeah.
All that.
Yeah.
And 2, this is also not including the special education weights. Just a few considerations to flag, which I think we've already spoken about, but I just wanted to put them on a slide, that it's going to vary significantly dependent on district boundaries, right? When we're looking at any sort of difference or relative change at the district level, it really matters what that district is, right? What is the makeup of that district? We're looking at FY 25 data. So we're talking about a future state, but we're looking at FY 20 current data. We know things will change in the coming years, and those changes are not going to be, we know they're likely to be not uniform across the state. And that there's different ways to analyze policy and funding changes, and that the district configuration will impact the relative differences in funding. And that's all I put together for this.
It's a lot of work.
Thank you, Julia.
You got a good night's sleep after that.
It's one way to put it.
So just one question that was raised earlier is how you did the modeling based on that, and I'm not asking you to do the math on the site, but we had considered what the administration's proposal looked like with a lower base at 13.2 and then the different weights. And just correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that the calculation was that it was about $183 million short of what we're currently spending. Is that correct?
That was the findings of the administration's work that they presented to you.
Thank you for the precision. And this, we're using Colby's weights. It is reflecting the current state of our education system and the expenses we're incurring, because she's using 2025 numbers.
Yes.
So I think that's where, and Rep. Higley's conversation is just that this is more reflective of our current state than was the report from APA and the future state, projecting what the future state is, given the evidence-based model about what theoretical districts could look like. I'm just stating that because in trying to decide if we should go with Dr. Colby's recommendations, it is more reflective of the current environment.
Higley?
So, for that $183 million that you're talking about could be reduced about $15 million. And again, what I did was I actually used a 82,000 student count at the 13,200. And then the 82,000 student count at 15,033. I should use the 83. So I mean, whatever that amount comes up to subtracted would be taken off that 183 million that the governors recommend had as a savings. So
That's way before the weights are applied.
Mm.
So you're gonna have, yeah. It's a much different, more complicated calculation.
So it would be a lot more than that, though. I mean, we're not, that $183 million is close now.
Not to present day or close to Dr. Colby's estimates.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Representative Odie.
I remember an early presentation by Dr. Colby where she was talking about a framework of how to look at this. And she was talking about funding what we currently have and then doing a 5-year, I think it was, plan or a 5-step plan to what to look for, where we would be able to do savings. So we would get savings. So we'd have to work on that. I don't have it right in front of me. I can't quickly pick it up, but I think looking at that would be it. Maybe we could look at that now to see how that fits in with the numbers.
Sure where that is.
Yeah. I'll see if I can.
Also there.
Julia, when you started, you asked which we wanted to do first, and I said the slides. What else did you have?
Sure. So I was just taking some notes during your conversation with John, walking through the language. I wanted to note on the identification of students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, that what is included in the language now is consistent with the way that students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds are identified in current law. Right? So under current law, the way of identifying those students is the higher count, either students identified for free and reduced price meals or based off of the Universal Income Declaration form. And we have seen, and we've talked about this in this committee, that over the last year or so, a significant increase in the number of students identified from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And Chair Kornheiser referenced this, that had to do with the direct certification. So students enrolled in Medicaid automatically would be enrolled in free and reduced price meals.
So they don't have to fill that form out anymore.
They still do. This is getting into the weeds of meals programs,
Right.
which I would be happy to do if that is the committee's interest. I just wanted to note that what we're looking at here in terms of identifying those kids is the same as existing law and was updated in Act 127.
And it's a better measure. I mean, it was an improvement.
And I think that actually through the slides and the questions, I touched on all my other notes. So I won't take up your time with them.
What's next? Either we go back to John or Julia stays with the next slide deck. Did you want to go to the next one?
It's up to your,
Oh,
I think we
Well-
should have the conversation about the decision about having the, moving from one foundation formula construct to the next foundation formula construct. It seems like that's sort of what's sitting in front of us. We have the information we need about that. And then we can talk about the spending over, what did you guys call it? The whiteboard doesn't have it anymore, does it?
Supplemental district spending.
oh, it's up top.
Can't read the whiteboard from the Zoom. So anyway, talk about the supplemental spending after lunch.
Representative Holcomb.
I appreciate that, Chair Kornheiser, because what I've been trying to think about as I look at these numbers and I look at Julia's analysis is what are these numbers doing? And I think I'm mindful that we're at a time of pretty unprecedented volatility at the federal level and significant disruption locally. And what I like about this is that this is describing where we are. And the difference between a foundation plan and the way we currently fund education is that the foundation plan is more stable and it gives us more of a solid base to work on some of the transformation efforts. And I know nothing is going to be perfect, but I do appreciate that what we're trying to do is figure out how to put some stability into the system so that we have a stable base on which to build some of the governance transition that is painful, but we know we have to sort of grapple and have a conversation around. So I do appreciate that. And I think we've also seen the importance of both being accountable to inflation, which will drive costs up. I'm still hopeful that the Agency of Education will get us information on cost drivers so we can be more strategic in our improvement efforts. But I think we also know that if we are successful on the governance reform, we will have to do another cost study in a couple of years, and we may be able to have a lower foundation plan because we're in a different place. So I see this as a starting point, and I think we need to have a stable starting point so that districts can feel safe as they begin to pivot. When we were talking about consolidation under Act 46, districts talked about how that's like being on a trapeze and letting go of your trapeze and reaching out to grab the hands of the person on the other trapeze. And what you can't have is people rip away the crash mats while you're in air. And I feel like we're going to be asking districts to make some big trapeze leaps. And the foundation plan is kind of like those crash mats. It sort of lets them know they've got a base on which they can work as they're trying to figure out how to move to a new and better place. So I know we all have lots of concerns. I have lots of concerns, but I do feel that this shift is an important one and we still have issues to work out. But to the extent that we can ensure that we have stable funding for districts that is targeted in ways that meet the need where it is and not based purely on whether districts decide to support the kids who need the support. I think we're setting ourselves up hopefully for some important work. So that's my thought about where we are.
Representative Burkhardt.
I am completely on board with the concept of going toward a foundation formula and all the work that we've done to get there. What I'm struggling with is that we don't have Dr. Colby here to ask questions about sort of the outcome of her numbers. So she gave us a lot of the prep work and a lot of the base for the design considerations and all of that. I'm seeing, in the rough outline of where we land, exactly what I was concerned about is that the whole region of Eastern Chittenden, Western Chittenden, Addison are all seeing decreases in their funding. Again, after having tax capacity taken away this year, and we'll continue to do that under Act 127 until we even get to this base. So I would just like a little bit more color on how the sausage was made and, what she's seeing as the drivers for why Chittenden and Addison are seeing decreases under this new formula if it's supposed to be based in where we are cost-wise at the moment.
Representative Maslin.
Yeah, read your interspersed representative Burkhart and both of the shots. Recognizing, as you said a while back, Representative Kimball, the districts won't be the same. Right. And so the numbers are gonna be different. What we have so far gives us let's say, a pretty good picture. But not to the dot by any means. I think what I heard Representative Holcomb saying, and maybe both of you, is, it behooves us well to do the best we can with what we have in front of us. To figure out where we are and how to make a decision, and I'm certainly in favor of going forward, knowing that there'll be some fine tuning along the way. I think that's kind of where it is. We do need to, putting our foot down is wrong terminology, but we do need to draw a line in the sand and figure out the most we can with what we've got. Otherwise, we're stuck in the sand, you know, so, but thank you.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. We had in the Act 127, we had a glide path. Remember? Representative Cornhaxer, we had a glide path. How does the glide path fit in with the new foundation fund?
So I think there are two, were you asking me, Carol? Sorry.
I'm kind of saying, I'm listening to Representative Burkhart.
Yeah.
And her concerns about Act 127 and the base amount. And that she sees decreases in that area, the state.
Because we're still on the glide path until we switch to a foundation formula. We're still on that glide path.
That is true. Okay, so we still, all right, that makes sense. If
We're
we
still on
can-
that glide path. And I guess from my
And when we
perspective,
get to the foundation formula, are we already 5 years out, so the glide path is over, or what are we doing about a glide path for the new formula, and the new formula?
so I think there are three different glide paths. There's finishing up the 127 transition, which I believe will be finished by the time we, by the time this is implemented, but would love Julia to check or anyone, any of the many staff people sitting there watching all of this to check my dates on that. That's my count of the years. So that would be finished. So that's one glide path. Then the bill, as it came to us from the administration, had us moving to a foundation formula that was designed around sort of an evidence-based future state, right? When like our schools are operating as efficiently and effectively as possible. And so there's the glide path to that, decade of work that will take, schools and the AOE and all of those people, a lot of effort, right? And some schools are way further along on that process than others. And we want to make sure that actual policy work gets done, right? And so there's the glide path to that. Using the cost factor analysis from Professors Colby and Baker is the glide path to the evidence-based foundation formula, because it's based on using today's dollars as efficiently and effectively. So it's still change, it's creating stability, as Representative Holcomb said. But it does it in a way that is designed around sort of the needs of today and then those needs will change. Then there's the glide path. I feel like I'm confusing myself, so I don't know if this is helpful at all. Then there's okay, great. So there's the glide path from the current law that we're living in right now to the foundation for the cost factor foundation formula. And in that system, and my understanding is that the Senate has a lot of ideas on that transition. the administration proposal that came to us moved to a block grant system, which sort of freezes in place the existing inequities, which strikes me as problematic. And so we have been silent on that sort of that first glide path, letting districts essentially sort of figure that out for a couple of years and having these numbers start with the new districts. So it'll be sort of business as usual until new districts come into place that would move to this. And so it's so hard, I think, but I'm really trying to like caution us to compare between what our schools and districts are doing now and how much they're spending, like how much they need, and when the first foundation formula will come into effect, because that lines up with when there's new district lines, new governance, new systems. It's the first year of that budget process. And there'll be there's transition money in the budget for that, like for the staffing end of that. So I wish I could make a diagram, but I can't. I guess I would. Yeah, I'll stop.
Are you thinking the foundation plan will be in effect for FY 27?
I was imagining that the foundation plan starts in the year that the first new board develops its first new budget. And so
it's in the language now for FY 27. No? 28. Oh.
So July 1, 27.
I asked John to add some more belt and suspenders on that so that it says both a date and, or maybe Beth, I asked someone inside an email. Sorry, John and Beth.
So to be clear,
add belt and suspenders to make sure that it's both the time that the new board starts and that date certain. So one can't happen without the other.
so we're under 127 until probably 29 is what we're saying. We're under Act 127 funding. That's your issue. Yeah, we got a problem. The other thing is I'm really struggling because to get to an evidence-based model in X years, we would also have to repeal Act 166 and make changes. We would have to repeal all the Act 77 flexible pathways. Like the way we do things is not actually what's in that model. So we would have to repeal a tremendous amount of statute to get to an evidence-based, PICUS model. And so I guess my question is that our goal? Should we be saying that we're going to review all the statute that schools have to cope with currently? That means they can't do PICUS? Is that our goal? Or are we trying to get to a more efficient and affordable model that is a Vermont model, that's a cost factor model in 6 years?
I think we're moving to an efficient and effective cost factor model. And then once districts have gotten used to just using a foundation formula, the work of that really hard work, that's the easy stuff, right? The hard work is changing how we deliver special education, all those things you just listed. And that's the work that has to happen before we move to the evidence-based model.
But they're not, it's like moving from, that word is really confusing me because a lot of the evidence-based model it's not just a scale difference from Vermont. Like, for example, PICUS said we could save a ton of money if we offered full day pre-kindergarten within our existing school system. We mandate vouchers at the pre-K level. Those are fundamentally different operating logics, and that has huge implications for cost. So are we going to repeal Act 166 to be able to get to PICUS? Because if so, we got to start doing that now. Are we going to get rid of flexible pathways and early college? Because those erode the scale that we're going to need to get to PICUS. So like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't see a glide path from cost-based to PICUS. I see a bunch of decisions about what education is supposed to be in Vermont and how we structure that is informed by the idea that scale and early intervention and a bunch of other stuff can make a difference. But
can I just say that we have to do both at the same time? Don't we have to look at what are the cost drivers and how we're organizing education, what things that we're funding, how it's organized, and also moving to a different way to pay for it?
I think we have to do both. I'm just struggling because evidence-based model is PICUS. It is a very specific definition of an endpoint that is not consistent with how we currently educate kids. It's a philosophical shift as well. I'm not saying it's bad, but we have to be really clear about that because we need to start inventorying all the statutes that we put in place that compel schools to do things that have nothing to do with the PICUS model.
Emily?
I think we are in some ways starting that glide path in this bill. There's the study around pre-K, there's work on dual enrollment, there's all of that to happen next year. That's exactly why we need to start with the cost factor before we move to the evidence base. And that the years are that glide path to move towards that evidence-based. That's why we need to start in exactly this way. I think the decision about what it's going to take to move to the evidence base, that's our work of next year and the year after. And we're setting that in motion this year with a bunch of the smaller pieces of this bill. That's what we need to still study, including special education, and really appreciate your work on that.
Basil? Jen?
Continuing this, I hope, find Representative Holcomb's outline of a process to be very helpful. And I'd also say that you are far more familiar with the act, this and that, what each one entails than many of us here. And I'll take it on faith that in order to get to a evidence-based model, which I think is where we want to go, even if we fiddle with it a little bit, there'll be a process that'll be necessary to repeal this in order to get to that and go through stuff like that. It might be helpful to someone like myself if we could work together and perhaps create a simple matrix, like 3 columns, 3 lines, or however many lines to say, act this, does this. It's contrary to what we need to do, or it's inconsistent. And here's where we want to get to. Here's what we need to do to get there. So that the graphically oriented here can sort of see the process unfold act by act, or where we are to somewhere else. And that would help me, but I don't have the facility with what to put this down.
I just don't, I don't think we can do what he has outlined in his bill. I think we can approximate it if that is our goal. I'm not sure that that's our goal because that's a.
Well, I'm not
issue.
advocating for going to the PICUS model.
Yeah.
But I need to understand there are the steps along the way if we go in a direction such as that. We may choose to do some of them and not others. But I'm not, I don't have your knowledge base to map that out myself.
Representative Odie?
So I understand that glide path area, but I still don't think that Representative Burkhart brought up is answered, and not, in part, it is. If Act 127, the funding glide path to help people getting, who are in tough situations with Act 27, they get that funding until 29. Emily, Representative Chair Kornheiser. They get that funding until 29, through 29 or what? If we weren't going to a foundation formula, and which we may not, but if
I believe that 29 would be the year that there would be no more. My understanding is that it was 5 years of tax capacity being pulled back.
Right.
And this is the first year, 25 was the first year. So 26, 27, 28 would be pulled back. And then 29 would be the final year where there's zero, like that, we would be at the weights in Act 127 fully in terms of tax capacity. My question is really for Dr. Colby, in that my conversations with her and like her presentations to us sort of said her cost factor analysis says this is the amount of funding you need to get to certain outcomes. So I really feel like I need to ask her that question. Are you saying that, because I know that we can't apply these to single school districts in the current model, but when you're talking about whole regions, are you saying that those whole regions right now are spending more than they need to get to a certain level of proficiency?
yes, that's a good question.
That's how I read this, and I'm confused about that because being in those regions, I'm not seeing that level of proficiency, and based on what those regions are spending now.
I would say that the numbers actually don't surprise me. And that's why I sent out that staffing level stuff. I think there are other issues here, but I think I mean, what I worry about, I mean, I'll be blunt, we are setting people up for a 12 cent or whatever, 10 cent spike. If we do the household exemption, that's another 30 cents or whatever, 3.5 cents on top of that. And we have districts that are losing 20% of their tax capacity each year for the next couple of years. We're overfunding some districts in some schools. And I don't know how people are gonna make it. Like, we're assuming that we're gonna have the consolidation of new districts starting and voting soon. I'm gonna tell you, Act 46 was brutal. And we have a lot more capacity to manage it than the current agency has. It's a lot of work. I mean, I wish we had done something to address some of the low-hanging fruit. As of now, I'm very worried right now.
Julia Richter, you have,
Yeah, Julia Richter, JFO, just to clarify, about the transition mechanism from Act 2027. So the way that it is currently structured is it was, the transition mechanism that was in Act 2027 was repealed last year. And a new transition mechanism was put in instead, right? Last year, there was the repeal of the 5% cap. So now the transition mechanism is a cent discount that steps down 20% year over year. So all school districts, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, all school districts have all of the long-term weighted ADM under Act 127. The transition mechanism is a subtraction of a certain number of cents reflective of their change in tax capacity.
Yeah.
And it's a 5 years, maximum 5 year step down. But some school districts only got the minus cents for 1 year, if they did not lose as much tax capacity, right? It's a maximum 5 year cent step down for the districts that saw the largest decrease in tax capacity.
So, Mr. Chair, before we go to lunch, I'm just thinking that what we're really trying to determine in this bill is whether or not to go to a foundation formula at all. And then within that, whether we can accept the base that has been estimated by Dr. Colby and Dr. Baker, and then the weights that are applied to it and how it would be administered. The numbers are subject to change in future legislatures based on the actual savings that can be achieved through reorganization. So if we are in this particular section, it's whether or not we want to go to a foundation formula. And then if so, what should that look like? Are these the right assumptions? And I think it's time for lunch, don't you think?
Yes.
well,
Yes.
you want to chew on this
Yes.
during lunch and come back?
Oh, yes.
At some point, get the pieces that made 15,033, and then the pieces they added up to get what 13,000, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And do we need those?
We have those details certainly from APA. I'm not sure if we have the same level of detail in Dr. Colby's work. Julia, do you know?
Sorry, what was the question?
The question was, I mean, we have all the details from APA and coming up with evidence-based formula, but do we have the same kind of level of detail that came out of Dr. Colby's work?
Not the way it works.
I guess I don't, the ways of modeling are just completely different. One is like a bottom up, the evidence-based model. And the other is a regression analysis based off of current education data used over the past 10 years. So essentially the way that Colby's model works is it says, okay, looking at across the state of Vermont, education spending data by district, proficiency levels, and using her regression analysis to determine the amount of funding needed to achieve certain proficiency levels. So it makes sense just from a pure, I'm not talking policy, from a pure math perspective, it makes sense that you would see areas that are going to see a decrease in spending or funding, and areas with an increase in spending or funding. Because you're shifting dollars around the state, saying, over here, there needs to be more funding spent in order to achieve those outcomes. And over here, based on the modeling, there is more spending than is necessary to achieve those outcomes, right? It's not applying a factor of, everybody needs to spend 10% more. Instead, it's looking at the analysis and examining, okay, what is the base amount per pupil based off of the regressions, 15,033. If a student is from a certain circumstance, how does that 1533 need to be adjusted? And when you, so looking at the memo, for instance, I would draw your attention on page 5, the exhibit 2. Essentially what it's saying here is a reflection of a big picture reflection of the modeling. So it's saying the base cost per student based off of all of the background analysis is 15,033, right? The base cost per long-term ADM per kid. And then it's saying, okay, for a student experiencing economic disadvantage, that student needs an additional 15,334. A student is an English learner, and we're not doing the tiered weights, but we're just doing one English learner weight. That student, because they're an English learner, needs an additional 20,896 on top of the 15,033. We know that across the state that pupil demographics are not uniform, right? We've looked at a ton of analysis over the course of the session that's looking at where we see certain population percentages of those student demographics. So it makes sense that you're going to have districts that have more weights applied or more cost adjustments applied in those districts that have more students that fit into those categories, which is where we see the calculation of the education opportunity. I can keep going, but I will also stop. I'm happy to help with interpreting the results.
I think that's good because the APA model had to make certain assumptions based on what they thought it would cost on their theoretical model, and then build up from there. And this is actually saying these are the actual expenses, and we're just going to do the math in order to arrive at your base. Right. That's and other extraordinary expenses, but yeah. Yeah, Joy.
May I say one more piece that I think is just helpful to keep in mind is we've also had a testimony towards the beginning of the session looking at different ways of calculating a foundation formula, a foundation amount, right? So you had that testimony from Rebecca Sibilia and Professor Colby and Education Commission of the States that were talking about the different modeling exercises. And you can intuitively think of it as two different ways to, at Kimball's point, like the bottom up approach where what are all of the building blocks, and we're going to cost out all of those building blocks, and that is how we're going to calculate the foundation amount. As the evidence-based model with the administration's proposal is based off of this efficient state evidence-based model. And the cost factor approach is looking at what is the current state and current spending, and how are the resources allocated to achieve those outcomes that are desired.
And I just want to draw people's attention to the fact that Professor Colby gave us a memo in addition to her PowerPoint that's on our page from yesterday that has a lot more detail.
17 pages. It's a great read. It's a page turner.
So, it's time to eat. We'll be back here at 1.
Our task for this afternoon, Mr. Chairman,
What's that?
our task for this afternoon would be
It's on the communication, yes.
straw poll.
Yep, and there's also.
Stop all.
There's
Section by section. I still have much to